Fear is one of life's most interesting emotions. We live our life doing just about anything we can to avoid it, while also seeking out ways to experience it in short, controlled bursts. Because fear is a primal fight-or-flight emotion, as soon as it kicks in, our bodies rapidly produce adrenaline to prepare us for what it thinks is a life-or-death situation. But that adrenaline rush makes us feel good. This rush is what the entire horror genre is predicated on, replicating this primal emotion and its side effects in short, controlled, safe bursts. I call this pleasurable fear. But the issue with most traditional vectors of horror is that we can never be active participants in them. We don't feel the fear firsthand. We feel it vicariously through an actor or a character that we have no control over. We just sit on the sidelines and experience it in diluted form through their actions. Attempts have been made over the years to try and make us active participants in horror, but these are either rare or very expensive. The two main things that come to mind are roller coasters and scare mazes, two fantastic sources of fear and horror, but unless you're living life in creative mode or just so happen to live in the town of Alton, you can't just experience them at the drop of a hat. They're really inaccessible. Enter video games. The strongest feat of games as a medium is their ability to have the player experience and influence their world firsthand. No form of entertainment rivals the immersion of video games, which made them the perfect candidate for delivering this pleasurable fear that we all crave through one of the longest running and most iconic video game genres, survival horror. A genre that birthed some of the biggest names in not just gaming, but entertainment full stop. A genre that completely lost its way and abandoned its identity. And a genre that experienced one of the greatest revivals of the modern era. This is the downfall and revival of survival horror. In the final 30 years of the 20th century, the movie industry was dominated by horror. This was the era of Aliens, Scream, and Halloween, and so, from very early on, game developers approached this seemingly never-ending trend with the intent to capitalize on it in ways that only gaming could. The truth is, for as long as there have been video games, there have also been horror games. As far back as the 80s, developers were creating games aimed at disarming the player and locking them in tight confined spaces packed full of locked doors, puzzles, and of course, horrors. But it was in the 90s where survival horror really came into its own. Partly thanks to the technological advancements of the time, but also thanks to pioneering franchises of the genre finally nailing down the secret sauce. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, Fatal Frame, Dino Crisis, and many other bangers that I can't remember right now all came onto the scene around the same time in the mid to late 90s, mostly exploding out of the Japanese market. Created with the sole intention of being the best source of tension and fear in the entire genre of horror. They wanted you on the edge of your seat, fearing every corner turn and door opening. They wanted you unsettled by the atmosphere and environment you were exploring, and equally disgusted and terrified by the horrors that you were trapped in the world with. But there was a problem. Gaming during this era was very heavily focused on making the player feel invincible. Doom, Quake, Half-Life, and GoldenEye. The market was eating up these first-person shooters that made their players one-man militias that could hold 10 different guns, had total freedom of movement, and could take on 30 different monstrous enemies from another dimension at once without batting an eye. And with that superiority comes the loss of tension. So, the pioneers of survival horror took a massive leap of faith and designed their games with polar opposite intentions. To strip the player of all of their strength, to make movement almost intentionally clunky and exploration of the world maze-like, and to make every single enemy such a threat that evasion is valued over engagement. As such, 3 core pillars of survival horror as a genre were established, and these pillars were shared across almost every game in the genre because, frankly, they were just so damn effective. First off, scarcity. Where FPSs focused on abundance of resources, survival horror instead limited how much a player could find and also how much a player could carry. forcing them to make tough decisions to ensure their survival. Ammo in survival horror is rare and precious, so you can't just go blasting your way through the Spencer mansion. The weapon sandbox is limited and also not immediately available. To find more firepower, you have to face your fears and venture deeper into the horrors of the world. The player character is typically rather weak, and healing items require careful rationing thanks to their scarcity. And the inventory, the kind of gravitational well around which all the sandbox and survival elements revolve, is intentionally restrictive in its size, so choosing which items to pick up and which to leave or discard is constantly front of mind. Survival horror's gameplay excelled at actually making players think about decisions that in other games required no thought. If you saw ammo on the ground in Doom, you never thought twice about picking it up. Like, why would you? Your inventory was infinite, there's no downside. But in survival horror, every action had a reaction. There was an upside and a downside to every single choice, which unintentionally added a little bit of realism to the games, and intentionally added tension to every single decision. This scarcity made you unprepared for most encounters, which amplified the horror of even the smallest encounter, and the fear of the unknown that was born from exploring a new area. And it's how survival horror handled exploration in its breakout era that formed its second core pillar: fixed camera angles. Again, where first-person shooters focused on giving players complete control of the camera, survival horror went the opposite way and relinquished that control. Instead, having the developers specifically curate where a camera would be in a room and how it would move. This allowed the developers to design encounters in a really cinematic manner, obscuring threats with objects in the foreground or using unique camera angles to highlight key items embedded in the environment. This stylization was combined with mostly claustrophobic level design and the unique tank controls to allow for clean cinematic cuts between areas, and also, according to Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami, a scarier experience. Although many people nowadays view fixed camera angles as merely like a technical limitation of the time, that couldn't be further from the truth. It really cannot be understated how much charm fixed camera angles added to Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and the like. Also, because the player didn't have the freedom to look wherever they wanted, it also allowed the developers to pre-render backgrounds, essentially having them be kind of like static images rather than complex 3D objects that the engine had to use precious resources rendering, which massively increased the graphical fidelity and, as a result, the immersion of these terrifying worlds. Seriously, this combination is an art form in and of itself. Every time I go back and play Resident Evil Remake, which released in 2002, I'm genuinely astounded at how good the world looks because of the pre-rendered backgrounds. And the third pillar that tied together the core gameplay and the world design is survival horror's iconic focus on puzzles. Specifically, the way that they make their environments, regardless of setting, feel almost like an interactive horror maze. Progression in survival horror is rarely linear. Puzzles and locked doors can be more a hindrance than the actual horrors in the world themselves, and often require extensive backtracking through areas that you've already explored to search for something that you didn't know was there. This can force the player into a rather uncomfortable position, where early on, they skipped through a room or avoided it completely because it was too difficult or too scary, thinking nothing of it. But now they have to revisit that room and face their fears to find a key or a puzzle piece to progress. Let me tell you, going back to the kitchen in the first Resident Evil was not something that I ever planned on doing, but the game forced me and I had to face my fears. But not only did these mechanics make you face your fears, they also made exploration of the world so rewarding in a way that very few other games were able to match. The level of satisfaction when finding a key item that you've been searching for ages for, or finally solving a puzzle, is some of the finest dopamine that you will find in all of gaming. Honestly, it's no surprise that the survival horror genre took off as fast as it did. To sum it up shortly, survival horror was the punk rock of gaming. It went out of its way to do everything differently, and in doing so, cemented itself as one of the greatest examples of what the medium of gaming could offer that no other medium could. Its success would carry forward out of the 90s and into the early 2000s as well. The juggernauts of the genre continued building upon their wildly successful formulas and expanding their universes with spin-offs and different takes on the genre. But in 2005, a game released that would alter the course of survival horror forevermore. A masterpiece of survival horror, unequivocally one of the best video games that has ever and will ever be made, and also a game that marked the beginning of the downfall of survival horror.
Resident Evil 4.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're enjoying, please consider subscribing. Thank you. Now, before we begin talking about the downfall of survival horror, it's important for me to get out ahead of a lot of the comments that I'm gonna get and say that survival horror didn't experience a traditional downfall. It's not like RTS, where 1 minute it was the biggest thing in gaming and then the next minute it was just completely gone and developers had dropped it and thrown it out like an old toy. Rather, the focus of survival horror shifted from pure horror to action horror. Some of the core elements were still intact, but many of the design philosophies fundamentally changed, and it all began with a game that I and many others consider to be the greatest survival horror game ever made.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Resident Evil is the backbone franchise of survival horror. It's simultaneously the pulse and the North Star of the genre, and so its direction shifting so drastically with Resident Evil 4 marked the beginning of a new era. Because of how insanely successful and well-received RE4 was, the industry used its formula as the blueprint for almost every single survival horror game that would release over the next decade. But they all failed to realize that realistically, RE4 was essentially lightning in a bottle. Now, this era is rather complicated because although, yes, it was a massive departure from the standards and the core design pillars that survival horror had established in the 90s, that doesn't mean it didn't have some absolute bangers. Dead Space, Fear, Condemned, Dead Rising, Bioshock, Alan Wake, and more that I'm probably forgetting. None of these games were traditional 90s style survival horror, but they're great examples of how the genre moved away from its roots and took on a totally different form during this era. If anything, traditional survival horror's downfall happened because developers finally had sufficient hardware to allow them to truly experiment with conveying horror through a video game. Gaming as an industry was also growing fast. Budgets were rapidly expanding, but so too were profit expectations, so the genre had to find a way to appeal to the masses more and not focus too hard on its own niche. Financially, it needed to expand to other markets, hence the shift to action. The downfall era of the genre was dominated by Halo, Call of Duty, and Battlefield. Every man and his dog was trying to get a piece of the big-budget blockbuster video game pie by replicating elements of these big hitters in their own products, often in place of what defined their previous titles and made them so popular in the first place, and as I'm sure we're all aware, it didn't exactly work. Now, I'm not talking specific features, but more like atmosphere, presentation, and overall design philosophies. As the mid-2000s turned into the late 2000s and early 2010s, it started to become clear that much of the industry had become too distracted by chasing larger audiences, and it wasn't exactly doing so in a faithful manner either. Action survival horror's pendulum was beginning to swing far too much in favor of action and far too little in favor of survival horror and what the genre once stood for. Slow, agonizing tension build-up was being traded out for Michael Bay explosions and Hollywood action sequences. The player became far too inherently powerful, which made any of the horrors that you still faced lose any of their horror because, you could overpower them so easily. Far less of an emphasis was put on disarming the player, which reduced the average tension in encounters because the player was just so well armed. By giving so much power to the player, natural tension was becoming less and less prevalent. It instead had to be forced with bigger horde sizes and longer encounters that forced the player to run low on ammo. The first Resident Evil had players terrified by just one lone zombie in a hallway, whereas Resident Evil 5 could throw 30 infected villagers at you and you wouldn't really feel a thing. With survival horror, less is definitely more. Games that focused on the natural buildup of tension by isolating the player, making them feel claustrophobic, trapped, and inferior to the horrors of the world were few and far between. Some action-heavy survival horrors like Dead Space managed to recreate these feelings while still emphasizing action, but many just weren't able to. And if you ask me, Resident Evil 6 was almost like the final boss of the Downfall era. It's no secret that RE6 was a contentious game. It was the amalgamation of every wrong step the genre had taken over the last 6 to 7 years, and served as one big crescendo that finally had people saying enough is enough to this new form of survival horror. Dead Space 3 released a year later as well, to a similarly lukewarm reception for a litany of reasons, but where it felt like Resident Evil 4 marked the beginning of the downfall of traditional survival horror, Resident Evil 6 marked the endpoint. Very little of the DNA that birthed and exploded the survival horror genre in the late 90s remained. The early 2010s were truly a dark period for survival horror. But little did we know, the dawn of a new golden era was right around the corner. Where big publishers were convinced that the audience just wasn't there anymore for slower-paced, action-light, tension-heavy horror experiences, indie devs were dead set on proving them wrong. And little did they know the era they were about to spark. In 2010, a little game called Amnesia: The Dark Descent released, created by Frictional Games. It was an incredibly traditional survival horror experience that focused on building tension and disarming the player. Prior to Amnesia, Frictional had worked on a similar episodic horror series called Penumbra, but something about Amnesia and its refreshingly traditional take on the gaming horror hit the sweet spot, and it couldn't have happened at a better time. The early 2010s were the beginning of the age of content creators. YouTube was exploding, Justin.tv was growing, and Twitch was right around the corner, and the influencer industry, God I hate that term so much, was about to go thermonuclear. People were beginning to turn their cable TV off in favour of watching gamers in their bedrooms play through games with funny moments, interesting thoughts, and entertaining reactions, and no genre of game was better suited for that kind of content than survival horror. A genre that was crafted with the sole intention of terrifying its players in ways that no other medium could, unintentionally made for the perfect Let's Play content. And boy oh boy did creators at the time capitalize on it. I genuinely believe that this second golden era that survival horror is going through right now is in large part thanks to creators in the early 2010s blowing up of survival horror games. Amnesia definitely began the trend of horror Let's Plays on YouTube, but there was one game that blew Amnesia into the stratosphere and cemented survival horror as a staple of YouTube gaming. Slender. The game itself was insanely simple. No weapons, no HUD, no story, no music, no voice acting, not even a real protagonist. Just you in a dark forest with nothing but a flashlight, hunting down 8 pieces of paper while being stalked and hunted by the Slender Man, a tall, suited entity with no face, born from creepypastas and internet forums. It seems quite insane to say in hindsight, but the more I look at it, the more I'm convinced that this game is one of the main reasons survival horror bounced back as well as it did. Slender was the definition of viral. Every single person from PewDiePie and Markiplier to Jacksepticeye and, believe it or not, your boy, was playing it and making videos about it, overreacting to the jump scares and the tension that it built in front of audiences of millions, or in the case of me, about 50 people. And this was just the beginning. The hyper-attention survival horror was all of a sudden getting spawned countless other indie and AA horror games that saw equal levels of virality. Five Nights at Freddy's was another Slender-like game that I'm sure we've all heard of, that was made in the wake of Slender's success, that was less about survival and more just pure horror, and absolutely exploded in popularity. I mean, it's still insanely popular to this day. A personal favourite of mine, Outlast, was a fantastic AA take on survival horror, set in a horrific abandoned sanatorium, filled with horrors of all varieties, a deep, intriguing narrative and lore, and experience through the eyes of a player character armed with nothing but a handheld video recorder, its night vision mode, and finite battery life. The early years of the revival were ruled by these experimental and highly unique indie takes on survival horror that were clearly made by OG fans of the genre, and they paved the way for what would come next, both in terms of the popularity they brought back to survival horror, and also the design philosophies they introduced to the genre. By 2014, the big dogs in the industry had taken notice of these games' success and had begun to capitalize on it. 2014 was actually, in hindsight, an absolutely fantastic year for survival horror. Creative Assembly released the critically acclaimed Alien Isolation, with Outlast-style gameplay set in the Alien universe. I mean, what's not to love? Hideo Kojima, a lifelong idol of mine, teased his ill-fated Silent Hill reboot, made in tandem with Guillermo del Toro and Norman Reedus, and subsequently released the now iconic PT demo. And Shinji Mikami, the god, the father of Resident Evil, together with his new studio Tango Gameworks, released the heavily Resident Evil 4 inspired Evil Within, which, by the way, is still one of the most underrated survival horror games of all time. I implore you, if you haven't played it, go and pick it up and play it, trust me. It was absolutely clear that survival horror was on the brink of its second golden era. So many incredible minds, pioneers of not just video games, but movies and TV and art in general, were all jumping on the bandwagon, emanating that same passion that they and their predecessors had in the 90s when pioneering the genre itself. And it only got better when the biggest shark in the survival horror sea decided to surface. In 2015, after the incredibly mixed reception to its last title, Capcom Dev 1 released the infamous We Do It video, announcing a modern remake of Resident Evil 2, arguably the brightest gem of the original survival horror golden era. What followed for Resident Evil was, well, banger after banger after banger after banger after banger. Resident Evil 7 released in 2017, taking the series back to its roots with pure survival horror, the style that its predecessors pioneered, but with modern twists, paying respects to the indie and AAA titles that revitalized the genre. And this, by the way, is still one of the greatest survival horror games ever made. The long-awaited Resident Evil 2 remake released in 2019, and is still to this day one of the greatest games ever made, somehow managing to match the original experience, paying homage to it wherever it could, while also trying new things with its foundations. Resident Evil 3 got a remake a year later, and although I personally enjoyed it quite a lot, it definitely wasn't a great remake and it was nowhere near as faithful. But then fear not, the bangers kept rolling a year later in 2021 with the release of Resident Evil 8 Village, a modern take on RE4's beloved formula with a House of Horrors style structure, packed full of hyper-memorable survival horror moments. And then of course, this year, the long-awaited and arguably riskiest game ever made, Resident Evil 4 Remake released, and not only did RE4 Remake match our expectations, it exceeded them in many areas.
Got a selection of good things on sale, stranger.
Like I said before, Resident Evil really is the backbone of survival horror. You can't have one without the other, and if one is struggling, then chances are the other one is too, and vice versa. This new era of Resident Evil with Capcom on an almost perfect streak of both remakes and new games is emblematic of the current state of survival horror. This genre has never been as healthy as it is right now. It's found a way to combine the absolute best of the 90s golden era with the experimentation and variety of the downfall era. Fans of both eras are eating so good. We've seen games like The Medium pop up, really traditional fixed camera tank control style survival horror. But then there's also massively popular new games like Dead by Daylight and the upcoming Texas Chainsaw Massacre that build off the multiplayer aspects of Resident Evil Outbreak to create competitive multiplayer survival horror. Remakes of other pioneering titles like Dead Space, Silent Hill 2 and Alone in the Dark are either already here and have been received exceptionally well, or are on the way. Brand new franchises have been created, and the major franchises have bright, fruitful futures ahead of them, steeped in the DNA of their beloved predecessors, yet massively popular with new and returning audiences. Hell, the genre has bounced back so hard, we even have bands naming albums and writing songs about the genre. If that's not a comeback, then man, I don't know what is. Survival horror may have had a rough time around the 2010s, but clearly that was just the genre's rebellious phase. Just like me in the ring at Creator Clash 3 next year, the genre has absolutely taken some punches, but it's gotten back up stronger than ever, and I cannot wait to see what the future holds for the masterpiece that is survival horror. Whilst we're talking about the great revival of survival horror, click up here somewhere to go and watch my video breaking down the masterpiece that is Resident Evil 4's remake. Huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there as per usual, and thank you all so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'll catch you all in the next one.